Peru is located in the west coast of South America. Lima is the capital of Peru. This is the central plaza of Lima. To the right side stands the impressive cathedral from colonial times. On the front sits the government palace, the official residence and principal workplace of the president, and Lima City Hall building is to the left. Like many Peruvian cities, Lima is a mixture of modernity and bygone times. Tall buildings and ample avenues in the districts of the upper-class people contrast with the congestion and the poverty of the districts of the middle class, the so-called young towns and the shanty towns. In the runoff election on May 10th of 1990, and against all public polls, the engineer Alberto Kenia Fujimori scored a stunning upset by winning the presidency against the predictions of all the pollsters. Alberto Kenia Fujimori is the son of Japanese immigrants in Peru, who became mathematics professor and chancellor of the National University of Agronomy in Lima, although he was unknown to most Peruvians. Fujimori ran in the 1990 elections, leading Cambio 90, a minuscule political party mostly made up of evangelical groups. Many factors contributed to his successful campaign: the severe economical crisis, rampant insurgency, illegal drug trafficking, and corruption during the Alan Garcia government. In addition, the discrediting of the traditional political parties generated the conditions for people to trust a newcomer to the detriment of the traditional political leaders.
Mrs. Bowen, how was the situation in 1990, and what was the role played by the Department of State, the CIA, and the DEA in the relationship with Fujimori's regime?
It was a very complicated situation in the early 90s because you had Sendero Luminoso, the Shining Path, a lot of terrorist activity to the extent that a lot of people thought the country was about to fall into the hands of the Shining Path. So the CIA were very interested in improving intelligence, finding where the terrorist leaders were hiding. They wanted Montesinos' involvement in helping to catch the terrorists. Now, they weren't at that point very interested in whether Montesinos was involved in the drugs trade or not. And I think that what we've called turf wars between the DEA and the CIA became very important. The DEA was doing its best to catch the drugs traffickers. The CIA was more interested in national and then hemispheric security, because at that point, if Peru became a serious security threat in the hemisphere, if Shining Path, this Maoist organization, were to take over Peru in some way, some Americans believed that the whole continent could start collapsing.
The massacres that took place during Alan Garcia's government deepened the Shining Path's hatred towards the system. And what is worse, those massacres increased the people's support for the Shining Path.
Another factor was the inability of the left-wing political parties to unite around a single candidate. In 1990, they ran in two separate fronts, and that division played in favor of Fujimori. Finally, Mario Vargas Llosa, the favorite candidate, joined in an alliance with the right-wing parties, old and discredited parties. They ran a millionaire and extravagant campaign that generated doubts and untrustworthiness in the middle class and the poor, who ultimately voted mostly for Fujimori.
First of all, Alan Garcia's policy put almost all state businesses on a road to bankruptcy because they were forced to deal with sales prices below their production costs. This led the government to have to subsidize these businesses, but since the government was in a crisis from hell, it ended up generating inflation, and therefore these businesses were driven into a state of near collapse.
García deja un país
Garcia left the country with hyperinflation and left the country with a discredited government due to corruption and mismanagement. And in a way, Fujimori is the product of Alan Garcia's government.
In 1990, the Peruvian voters had three well-defined electoral options: the traditional right-wing parties led by Mario Vargas Llosa, the APRA in the center, and the left-wing parties in two blocks, the Socialist Accord and the United Left. So, who voted for Fujimori?
In the first round, the APRA, or APRA party, got 20% of the votes. It couldn't have done better. It was hard to believe that APRA would get 20% with hyperinflation, violence, and everything else going on. So the votes for Fujimori in the first round didn't come from APRA. That happened in the runoff election. So who voted for Fujimori in the first round? People from the left wing, mainly from the left.
However, two very important factors contributed to Fujimori's electoral victory. One was the involvement in the electoral process of the then Peruvian president, Dr. Alan Garcia.
Garcia feared that an eventual government of Vargas Llosa would investigate the cases of corruption in his own government. So he sided with Fujimori. He advised him. Mr. Hugo Otero, Garcia's advisor, began advising Mr. Fujimori. Mr. Fujimori consulted with Garcia regarding the debate, on how he should confront Vargas Llosa in the debate. And the APRA enthusiastically received Fujimori's victory as theirs.
Second, probably the key ingredient to his successful campaign was an apparently fortuitous event. It was the chance meeting with the duplicitous drug trafficker's defense lawyer, Dr. Vladimiro Montesinos. The sociologist Francisco Loaiza, strategist of Fujimori's campaign in 1990, explains it like this.
Fujimori was the candidate that I was putting on stage. I was Fujimori's campaign strategist. At that time, Fernando Olivera, who was recently the ambassador to Spain, began a campaign against Fujimori, accusing him of tax fraud. Allegedly, Fujimori had sold a house for $18,000. It was really sold for $60,000, but he was making it appear as if he had sold it for $18,000, a house in the district of La Molina.
Only one house? It is said they were about 54 houses.
Well, they just found out about one. He had been involved in other real estate transactions. So, when Olivera began this campaign, Fujimori was my candidate. So I had to find a way to protect him from this impasse. Because deep down we knew there was a plot to take him out of the electoral race. I found out that Montesinos was working as an advisor to the Attorney General Pedro Méndez Jurado, whom I mention in my book. To me, Montesinos was the right person to call. I called him, and a few minutes later he was in my house asking me for all the documentation I had that could help in solving Fujimori's problem. He did the job, and for Fujimori it was top-notch, because he got the charges dropped in 3 days, which allowed Fujimori to continue his political career. He made arrangements to resolve Fujimori's legal problems. He created legal problems for the adversary. He put Fujimori in contact with military commanders. He gave him information about how the government worked and persuaded him to be less scrupulous. In this respect, the psychological factor plays an important role. When he was elected, he had no structure, no political programs. All the people supporting him were only after their own specific interests, acting at times as if they were clients, and he knew he was extremely weak. He had defeated the most important right-wing parties and coalition of business groups in Peru, who were calling for a coup in the streets. He also had an enormous distrust in sectors of the army hierarchy who thought that his government would be weak in confronting subversion, which at that moment was growing. And, to top it off, the left, at that time divided, decided to support him, arguing the following: that Fujimori's government would be a weak one, and therefore the working class organizations would achieve more with him than with the eventual Vargas Llosa government, which people believed would be similar to President Cristiani's government in El Salvador or other similar governments. Under these circumstances, Fujimori found himself operating in a vacuum, with no one he could count on. Montesinos' audacity enabled him to portray himself as the one who would be able to fulfill Fujimori's needs. What we have to ask ourselves is, how did Fujimori, a man distrusting by nature, come to believe in and trust Montesinos to fill this role? There must have been some convincing evidence that led him to this conclusion.
But in 1990, it was known that Montesinos had been an army captain expelled dishonorably and sent to prison.
He was expelled from the army. I know all the details. He was expelled from the army because he deserted his post. Immediately after, he turned to some of his old friends from the time when he worked for General Mercado Jarrín, and one of them, a colonel who was working in the migrations office, got him a passport, and Montesinos was able to leave the country with the excuse that he was going on vacation. He traveled to the U.S., running away, without reporting to his command unit.
And he was found guilty of abandonment of post, document forgery, and
or abandonment of destination, as they say. Secondly, he was charged with forging documents to obtain a passport. Officers and soldiers have to apply for passports through the Army's offices. They are not authorized to get them in any other way but through the Army, so he committed several military offenses. That is why they imprisoned him, for desertion of post. Later, in 1982, he was charged for treason and arrested, because they discovered that he had sold documents to the CIA, had sold documents to Ecuador, and so on. It was not until then that they put him on trial again. But unfortunately, the military Supreme Court dismissed the case and set him free.
Montesinos' efficiency was enough to convince Fujimori that this former captain, accused of being a CIA agent and cashiered from the army, was just the man he needed as his personal advisor. Between June 10th, when Fujimori won the runoff elections, and July 28th, when he assumed the presidency, a crucial event took place. On Montesinos' advice, allegedly for security reasons, Fujimori and his family moved to the Circulo Militar facility, an exclusive military resort compound for high-rank army officers. The real reason, however, was to put him in contact with some army commanders who had prepared their own plan of government and wanted to discuss it with him. The military plan was very simple. The president will carry on their plan of government with the military support. Did the military plan exist? Did Fujimori agree with the military? Was there a threat of military coup against him?
Oh no, yeah, the Plan Verde was a reality. Yeah, this was a military scenario. No, I mean, something that had been prepared at the end of Alan Garcia's regime. Hypothesis leading towards a coup, and then a sort of a long-term authoritarian government with a civilian head of government and state backed by the armed forces. And this is Montesinos is sort of I think that Montesinos actually is the guy that sort of introduced Fujimori to that, Plan Verde, and Fujimori said, "I'm the man." Here I am.
So it's possible that the self-coup was a consequence of that plan updated.
Oh, yeah. It actually it fitted right in to Plan Verde because the coup led to a new constitution that allowed re-election. And this was the idea. 5 years is too short a time. You need re-elections. You need a long-term president, and this was one of the basic elements there. So
ganada la elección, Fujimori
Having won the election, Fujimori was taken into confinement by Montesinos. In these secluded meetings, the main decisions were made by Montesinos and Hernando de Soto. Hernando de Soto was Fujimori's contact to Javier Pérez de Cuellar. Javier Pérez de Cuellar put him in touch with the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, and they welcomed him in an unusual way, because he was not yet the president, and even more unusual because he was such an unorthodox person. And they explained the manner in which they would deal with him, provided that he decide to break away from Garcia's regime. Fujimori, being a pragmatic person, as you have mentioned, discovered that his future depended on his relationship with the IMF, and that the problem was his relationship with the military. But first he had to resolve the economic problem. His downfall could come from the military. Therefore, his success would depend on an alliance with the military. And to do that, he had to, in the economic field, let the International Monetary Fund take charge. So, he simply gave them the control of the central bank's computer. The Monetary Fund managed the central bank's computer, which was connected to the computers of the Ministry of Economy. It was the strictest monitoring ever, before the Argentinian crisis.
On July 28th of 1990, Alberto Fujimori swore under oath to be the president of Peru. For most Peruvian people, that day would mark the beginning of the most outrageous decade of their history. Their shock and disappointment would start the very first day of Fujimori's government. His first measure was the appointment of Vladimiro Montesinos as the chief advisor of the National Intelligence Service, an agency that reports directly to the president. The same day, Fujimori announced the names of high-ranking military commanders that would be retired and the new commanders who would replace them. Both lists had been proposed by Montesinos and approved by the president. The biggest surprise would come, however, the evening of August 8th in a televised announcement by the Minister of Economy, Juan Hurtado Miller. The government announced a drastic package of economic measures that increased the prices of food, services, fuels, and other goods. This was precisely the unpopular economic shock policy that Fujimori had promised not to carry out.
Look, in just one day, the price of gas went up 430%. In one day. And of course the devaluation was brutal. The people's income lost all value, to the point that all restaurants, stores and businesses around the country closed for 2 days, because they didn't know at what price to sell their products, nor did they know how to react to the effects of the shock. Why did Fujimori apply an economic shock, having preached a non-shock economic plan? I think it is because immediately after he won the runoff elections, and facing no plan of government of his own, Fujimori contacts the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank and becomes convinced that he has to come to an agreement with them. So he applies the IMF's recipe of an economic shock in a radical way. Other Latin American countries also carried out politics of economic shock, but they did so in conjunction with social programs, which helped the people to overcome the impact that the economic shock would produce. Fujimori didn't do that. He applied the shock without provisions.
In order to reinstate Peru as a country eligible for credit, and spurred on by the International Monetary Fund, Fujimori started an extensive process of privatization, selling off hundreds of state-owned enterprises. The privatization has been Fujimori government's biggest fraud to Peruvian people.
Would you admit that Mr. Fujimori was so inexperienced in politics that could have been really trapped and manipulated by Montesinos and his mafia?
No, because I will have to admit, simultaneously, something that is impossible to believe. That is, that Fujimori is stupid. And I can tell you that he's brilliantly astute and wickedly efficient in his poses. Don't forget how he got to be in power. He got to power promising a populist alternative, and later he applied the economic shock. And then he put the country on sale for $10 billion, selling, for example, the Peruvian airline, a business worth $180 million for only $19 million. Don't tell me that Fujimori was naive. If there's something that he could never be, it was precisely that. Naive.
Fujimori's government brought a profound change to Peru's economy. It not only privatized state-owned businesses that were very important to the country, but also went even further by selling them to foreign investors. A huge number of strategic, fundamental manufacturing and service businesses in our country are now in the hands of foreigners. Those who hold the reins of power in these corporations are not Peruvians. Yet, at the same time, the Fujimori government concentrated wealth and property in the hands of a few, exacerbating the already deep social and economic gap among Peruvians. Look, I think Peru had a great opportunity to have an efficient government with the privatization process. The privatized business's worth, estimated at a low price, was $17 to $18 billion. They were sold off at $9 billion. Thus, they made such a dirty deal because they were merely interested in filling their pockets. You have seen the videos showing Montesinos paying bribes with bundles of bills to television and newspaper owners.
About the selling of the state-owned businesses and industries, what was the benefit for the country and for the Peruvian people?
Nothing. What was sold would have been worth about $30 billion. It was sold at a price close to $11 billion due to undervaluation. From these $11 billion, almost 3 to 4 billion were used to pay several commissions, meaning that all persons involved in the negotiations pocketed around 30% of the cash. The International Monetary Fund ordered that the money from the privatization be placed in a special reserved fund, untouchable, because they didn't want this money to be used for general expenses. Later, Fujimori got some authorizations for specific expenses, such as military weapons and welfare programs. A short time before Fujimori left the government, he made an incredible announcement that at the time was hard to believe because we never could have suspected. The privatization account balance was only $500 million. The $500 million were less than the total interest that the money should have generated. That means the account balance was negative, but the interest had kept a small amount. This is what happened with the privatization. In short, the country didn't benefit at all from privatization. So that I could say, for instance, look at those 10 highways, those 20 harbors, those hospitals, etc. They show that we exchanged mining companies for hospitals. No, there's nothing like that. Absolutely nothing. From the 80s to the 90s, there was a process of subversion going on, which by the end of the decade seemed unstoppable. And there were many urban terrorist attacks. There was also such economic mismanagement. Let's remember that Garcia's government had just ended. That a group of high-ranking military commanders agreed that an authoritarian government was necessary to fight subversion with an iron fist, at a high social cost. But then, surprisingly, Fujimori appears on the scene. And shortly after, there was still another surprise. Fujimori was willing to do so. Fujimori simply took the military recipe, though not with the same people. The people that prepared the coup were displaced by Montesinos, but the idea, the program was the same. And that was what occurred from 1990 on.
In order to carry out this dirty counterinsurgency war, it was necessary to modify the anti-subversion laws, which was not an easy task because Fujimori did not have enough votes in Congress. Fujimori and Montesinos adopted another strategy.
Advised by Montesinos since 1990, he ran a campaign to discredit Congress and to discredit the judiciary, two institutions that were already discredited, but they were systematically attacked to diminish them and prepare the ground for the coup.
But in June 1991, the Congress had delegated a special legislative decree power to the president, and based on this, Fujimori enacted 126 decrees.
The Congress also passed the bill to start the process of privatization and to produce some of the neoliberal reforms that Fujimori was proposing. Therefore, Fujimori led the coup in 1992. Not because the Congress opposed him, but to the contrary, I would say, the Congress cooperated with him in many of his initiatives. However, it maintained a fair level of supervision, mainly over human rights matters or government's abuse of authority. Fujimori and his mafia organization led the coup because they knew that in order to take control of the state, he had to eliminate all the democratic checks and balances that an independent judiciary and an independent Congress represents.
On November 12th, Fujimori put a new military service law into effect, This law eliminated the traditional promotion system based on seniority and merits. Now, the president would have the exclusive power to nominate the commanders-in-chief of several branches of the armed forces, to whom Fujimori could maintain inactivity as long as he wanted. President Fujimori also gave his wife, Susanna Iguchi, a taste of his despotism. Few months after Fujimori took power, Mrs. Fujimori had denounced that her husband's sister and brother were misusing and profiting with the donations sent by the people of Japan.
Susanna Iguchi's denouncements started very early, almost at the beginning of Fujimori's government. It was in 1990 when she began to express the uneasiness she felt concerning the management of used clothing donated by Japan, which she said was misused by one of Fujimori's sisters that was selling the clothes. Later, she began to elevate the tone of her critiques, until she finally ended up being basically jailed or held hostage in the governmental palace. The president went so far as to weld shut the door of her room to prevent her from leaving, until he finally kicked her out of the palace and virtually took her children away from her, creating an emotional situation that was extremely hard on her.
Primero, disolver temporalmente el Congreso de la República. Segundo, reorganizar totalmente el Poder Judicial.
Fujimori staged his self-coup on Sunday, April 5th of 1992. The Thursday before, 72 hours earlier, his wife had denounced the Fujimori siblings, led by his sister Rosa, were stealing the Japanese donations, including the clothes. That happened on Thursday. The coup took place on Sunday because on Friday the Congress had announced the nomination of a committee to investigate the First Lady's denouncements. So the chronology is perfect. The timing is exact. Denouncement by the First Lady against her husband's family, from whom she was not yet separated, and then the coup. Congress collaborated with Mr. Fujimori in almost everything it could, until it began to be the target of Fujimori's constant insults, which created the mood that the Congress was dispensable. Since the beginning, Fujimori had dreamed of an executive branch without Congress. He needed the excuse and the timing, and that was given by his wife. The coup dissolved the Congress, repealed any investigation, and of course he locked Mrs. Susanna Iguchi as if she was imprisoned inside the governor's palace.
It was very convenient for Fujimori because Fujimori had been elected without a majority in Congress because he rose so quickly and so late in the election process. He had a minority in Congress for his party, so he was finding it very difficult to govern. It was quite clear that a military coup, a palace coup, a self-coup, whatever you call it, was very convenient, and we also know from people that we've interviewed that Montesinos was talking to people about it as early as the November before the April, that is almost 5 to 6 months before the coup. Montesinos was discussing it with people. So they were going to do it anyway. However, I think you can't underestimate the situation, the danger that Sendero Luminoso at that point posed to Peru. It was a serious threat. So while it was a pretext in a way, it was also a very useful pretext. Montesinos always wanted a coup. It's clear from the people that he talked to and his own his own personal feeling that the military were really the only people who can run Peru. I mean, that's what Montesinos felt. He always felt that. Now, Fujimori might have resisted that a little bit more, but with the added impetus that Sendero Luminoso, Shining Path, was really threatening Lima. It had circled the city. There were bombings on a daily basis. It was getting very dramatic. So I think that the various things came together. It was extremely convenient for Montesinos, and of course it was perfect. It was what he had wanted all along. It also gave a free rein to drugs trafficking. I think it may make it too complicated in your story, but it's very interesting that the first aeroplane of Fernando Ceballos, who has now just been arrested, as you know, for drugs trafficking, came into Peru 2 days after the coup. The very first plane for his airline, which then became a narco airline, came into Peru on the 7th of April 1992. Now, I don't believe that's coincidence. And it gave them the perfect scenario to clamp down, be authoritarian, rule with an iron fist, and traffic drugs.
You say in your book that Fujimori and Montesinos built a facade of democracy. Can you explain that, please?
That it looks like a regular democracy. There's a judiciary that on the face of it is independent. There's a legislature that's doing what its legislature is supposed to do, at least on the face of it. But in fact, Fujimori and Montesinos are controlling everything through the bribes, through the blackmail.
Mm-hmm. What was the U.S. government and Organization of American States response?
You know, the Americans, as you can see, almost immediately after the coup, within days, more or less forgave Peru. In fact, the international community, with the exception of a few Latin American countries, was very soft on Peru after the coup.
What we saw in 1992 was a typical military coup. Congress was shut down, they took control of the judiciary, and they made the necessary changes in the diplomatic body and among the military commanders so that the coup's leaders could take control of the state.
Fujimori also intervened the National Council of Justices. What is the role of this institution?
The National Council of Justices, CNM, was created by Fujimori, and it was supposed to be an institution to oversee the courts and judges. Nevertheless, along with this, Fujimori created a committee to intervene and reorganize the judicial branch, which he called Executive Secretarial Office of the Judicial Power, from which they administered the budget, no longer managed by the Supreme Court, and from which they appointed the judges and members for the courts.
Wasn't this rather a Montesinos exclusive operation?
No. Montesinos was an operator and a partner of Fujimori.
I think the key on their relationship is that they needed each other. What I think is very interesting is that together, separately they were very weak, but together they became very strong. Montesinos was, for Fujimori, in many instances, the link to the military. And so he's linked to a very important base of support. But Montesinos himself could not ever become the president of Peru. He was totally unelectable. So in that sense, he needed Fujimori to be president, to be the visible head of the state, while he was the one in the shadows.
Mr. Uceda, you investigated several cases of murder that took place before Fujimori's self-coup. What did you find?
Well, I state in my book that in 1990 and 1991 there were special operations. That's what they were called. Operations that included intimidation, murder, and other illegal actions carried out by the army. These actions were attributed in part to the Shining Path, as well as to the police. But actually, they were carried out by the army, and this was unknown in many courts until my book came out.
Just a month later, after the coup, a new massacre took place. The police and the death squad Colina, in a bloody attack on the Canto Grande jail in Lima, crushed a riot of Shining Path prisoners. 42 prisoners were murdered, allegedly, some of them executed after they had surrendered.
The military was in control of La Cantuta campus since May of 1991, when Fujimori ordered the military intervention of several public universities, like San Marcos, the Engineering National University, and the University of Education La Cantuta. Allegedly, these universities were a safe haven for terrorists and had to be stopped. It was known at that time that there were members of the intelligence service that had infiltrated the university, who I assume would write the reports in which some of the names of students who participated in protests may have been listed. The main people that were in charge of identifying and elaborating these lists were two army officers. Officer José Tena, a student who was an undercover whistleblower for the intelligence service and who is now in prison, and Officer Aquilino Portela. There was also a professor, Mejía Martel, who now lives in the United States and was also a collaborator. Since the first moment our family members were detained, we have always demanded proof of their responsibility, if any. If they say they were arrested students identified with Shiny Path, then we want to see what proof they have to accuse them. 13 years later, after going through a trial in a civil court, a trial in a military court, we're now in another trial, and they have never shown us any kind of proof linking our relatives with Shiny Path or the MRTA or any other terrorist group.
A few days later, the Colonel Edmundo Obregon, chief of the Army Rangers School, was murdered by the death squad Colina, as a revenge for having denied the use of the school facilities to hold down the kidnapped students.
You worked in the Mariela Barrero's case. You actually interviewed her.
As it happened with many of this type of denouncements, it came as an anonymous phone call to the Contrapuntos editing office, which was the TV show I was working for. Of course, we contacted Leonor La Rosa's mother, Mrs. Leonor Bustamante, and she told us a little bit about the torture suffered by her daughter in the basement of the Army's Intelligence Service building, and the names of the officers who had tortured her. This testimony, however, was not enough to make a serious claim on the TV show. After 2 weeks, having videotaped Mrs. Leonor Bustamante's declaration, we decided to interview Leonor La Rosa in the military hospital where she was, because that would be the only way we could denounce it on TV. It was there where we recorded the interview with Leonor La Rosa, and indeed, she had signs of burns in her fingernails, her fingertips, and ankles as she claimed. While at the military hospital, she learned that her colleague Mariela Barreto had been missing, and days later she was found dead beheaded, and dismembered. She was also an Army Intelligence Service agent, that she thought, if this has happened to Mariela Barreto, who was accused of leaking information to the media about the Death Squad Colina, what could have happened to me?
Do you believe that these massacres carried out by the Death Squad Colina had Fujimori's acquiescence?
For me, it is very hard to believe that Fujimori was not aware of all of this. Because if you look at his psychological profile, you will see he is not a naive person. On the contrary, he is a very smart, astute person, someone very alert with sharp senses. Therefore, I find it incredibly hard, if not impossible, to believe that he did not know that all these things were happening. In addition, there was news and very well documented reports in the media about all these things going on. And finally, the Colina Death Squad, responsible for all these murders, is uncovered and its members sent to jail. Fujimori, in collusion with his majority party in Congress, passed an extensive amnesty law not only for the army officers who previously had attempted a coup against him, but also for the members of Colina's death squad.
On September 12th, Abimael Guzman, leader of the guerrilla group Shining Path, is captured by a police's intelligence special group in a middle-class neighborhood of Lima.
The capture of Abimael Guzman was a process that started back in the year 1989. Fujimori and Montesinos had nothing to do with his capture. Abimael Guzman's capture was accomplished by the Police Special Group of National Intelligence, GEIN, or GEIN as it is known. This was a specialized police counter-terrorist group that ultimately became known as the GEIN in 1989.
The merit is for this group, the GEIN, which was made up of smart policemen who always thought the best way to fight terrorist groups was not to respond with state terrorism, but with state intelligence. Because, as with General Videla's methods in Argentina, what the counterterrorism policies had produced until then was to get more people supporting the Shining Path.
The strategy that was applauded for successfully defeating the insurgency, I mean the rondas campesinas, or the paramilitary peasant groups, the deals with the collaborators and defectors, the prison system, etc., are all the product of Fujimori's period. These are Montesinos' laws passed between 1991 and 1992 before Fujimori's coup, which the Congress tried to block, and also some laws that came after the coup.
In these circumstances, Fujimori decided to move to the National Intelligence Services building. He needed to be closer to his advisor, Vladimiro Montesinos. Important decisions would have to be made soon.
Look, if you had the opportunity to visit the facilities of what today is called the National Council of Intelligence, and before was called the SIN, or National Intelligence Service, you could verify that on the second floor of the building, at one end of the hall, had been living Vladimiro Montesinos, and at the other end, Alberto Fujimori, his children and his mother.
One of those decisions was to call an election for a constituent Congress to write a new constitution, which, they thought, would legitimize their government.
Besides that, it allowed him to run for re-election, which was forbidden in the 1979 Constitution, and at the same time, he manipulated some state institutions. This new constitution allowed his government to change the number of justices of the Constitutional Court. This constitution created the conditions for the executive branch to interfere in the judicial system. There were many other significant changes.
Fujimori's plan was to concentrate all the power in the executive branch, which the new constitution allowed him to do. Secondly, his plan aimed to weaken the state's role in overseeing the economy in order to carry out his neoliberal economic plan, and also aimed to diminish the people's civil and workers' rights, which the 1993 constitution also sanctioned.
The previous constitution did not allow immediate re-election. Was this the reason why Fujimori called for the Constituent Congress in 1993?
That was one of the reasons. No? There were probably other reasons like dismantling the judiciary, taking control over Congress. It was also going from a bicameral Congress to a unicameral Congress. So, but of course, the re-election was the main issue on that point.
Okay. To refer back to what we were saying before, building the facade of democracy, they're under quite a lot of pressure, Fujimori and his government, from the United States and from the Organization of American States to return to democracy after the coup of 1992. So they want to build something that looks like a democracy but that they can control, and that, I think, explains a lot of their actions from 1992 on, including writing this new constitution.
The evening of November 13th of 1992, a group of army generals and colonels, led by retired General Jaime Salinas, attempted a coup to remove Fujimori and reinstate democracy. Fujimori, warned by the intelligence service, quickly moved out of the palace of government and headed to the embassy of Japan, where he hid for several hours. The coup attempt failed. General Salinas and his supporting officers were arrested, beaten, and some of them tortured. Ultimately, they were expelled from the army and sent to prison. A process of purge of army officers followed the attempt of coup. Fujimori, Montesinos, and General Dibari Hermosa took advantage of this event to get rid of some of the military officers who had not showed sympathy for Fujimori's government. They were falsely accused of being part of Salinas' plot and discharged from the army.
At the end of 1993, President Fujimori and Montesinos had almost total control over the military, the judiciary, and the electoral jury, which is the institution in charge of overseeing the electoral processes. The intelligence service headquarters became the government's central command. From there, they plotted to manipulate national institutions with the goal of staying in power indefinitely. A ceaseless process of repression and corruption followed until the regime's fall in 2000, when some videotapes leaked to the media show Montesinos bribing congressional representatives, TV and newspaper owners, and others to support the government. President Fujimori fled to Japan, where he claimed Japanese citizenship and resigned to the President of Peru by fax.
¿Te ha servido la... Sí, no la bolsita de servido, los trabajos regados ahí, tema de simular, tema de todo negro.